I know I'm just an old guy spinning tales, but some tales aren't meant to be ignored. Trust me, you'll want to hear this one. So turn down the lights, settle in, and let's dive into today's chilling stories. Before we begin, a fair warning. What you're about to hear is purely for entertainment. These stories and theories, they're nothing more than shadows in the dark. No proof, just whispers carried by the night. Listen closely, but don't say, "I didn't warn you." Viewer discretion is strongly advised. It was supposed to be a normal Saturday night. Just us hanging out, doing nothing. Jake was flipping through channels. Sam was scrolling on her phone, and Chris and I were arguing about whether pineapple belongs on pizza. It didn't. But then Jake found it. Something that changed everything. "Guys, check this out," he said, spinning his laptop toward us. His face was lit with that mischievous grin that usually meant trouble. "What now?" Sam groaned, not even looking up. Jake leaned in closer to the screen, his voice dropping like he was sharing some big secret. "It's a carnival," Chris snorted. "A carnival? Seriously? That's your big find?" No, Jake said, his grin widening. "Not just any carnival, the Midnight Carnival. It's invite only. Supposedly, it pops up out of nowhere, stays for one night, and then disappears. And guess what?" He held up a black envelope. "I got us tickets." That got Sam's attention. She looked up, frowning. "Tickets? To what? Some underground circus?" Jake shook the envelope dramatically. "No idea, but look at this." He slid the card onto the table. It was jet black with gold lettering that shimmered in the dim light. The Midnight Carnival, where dreams come true. Be ready by midnight. I'll admit it, my first thought was, this is a scam. I mean, who sends out cryptic invitations to a carnival with no details? But Jake was Jake, and he was already halfway convinced it was the coolest thing ever. "This is so sketchy," Sam said, crossing her arms. "What kind of carnival doesn't advertise? And who even gave you this?" Jake shrugged. "It just showed up in my mailbox. No return address. Just, there." "That's not weird at all," Chris muttered. Jake ignored him. "Come on, think about it. When's the last time we did something exciting? Something actually fun?" I hesitated. It wasn't like he didn't have a point. We were always stuck in the same routine. Work, school, and nights like this, sitting around doing nothing. But this felt off. "Okay, but what if it's, I don't know, dangerous?" I asked. "Like one of those urban legend things where people disappear?" "Oh my God," Jake said, rolling his eyes. "It's a carnival, not a cult. They probably just want us to buy overpriced tickets and ride a Ferris wheel." Chris leaned back in his chair, smirking. "So you're saying we're going?" Jake grinned. "Absolutely." Sam groaned, but even she looked intrigued. "Fine. But if this turns out to be some weird scam, I'm blaming you, Jake." "Blame me all you want," he said, grabbing his jacket. "Just don't forget your ticket." We left at 11:30, driving out to the address printed on the back of the card. It led us to an empty field on the outskirts of town. The road was barely lit, and the farther we drove, the thicker the fog became. "Are we sure this is the right place?" Sam asked, peering out the window. "Because it looks like we're heading straight into a horror movie." Jake checked his phone. "This is the spot. Maybe they haven't set up yet." "Or maybe we're about to get murdered," Chris said, only half joking. But then we saw it. Through the fog, a massive Ferris wheel came into view, its lights twinkling faintly like distant stars. The whole carnival stretched out before us, brightly colored tents, spinning rides and food stands glowing under strings of lights. It was beautiful, but wrong somehow. There were no crowds, no sounds of laughter or music, just an eerie stillness, like the carnival was holding its breath. "Okay," I said, swallowing hard. "This is officially creepy." Jake was already out of the car. "Come on, it's awesome." We followed him reluctantly, our shoes crunching against the gravel as we approached the entrance. A tall man in a tattered top hat stood by the gate, his face hidden behind a porcelain mask painted with a permanent grin. "Welcome to the Midnight Carnival," he said, his voice smooth and theatrical. "Your tickets, please." Jake handed over the envelopes, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. The man examined them carefully before bowing deeply and sweeping his arm toward the gate. "Enjoy the show," he said. "And remember, the games are where dreams come true." Inside, the carnival was even more surreal. The ride spun silently, the lights flickered, and the air smelled faintly of burnt sugar and something metallic. But there were no other people, no crowds, no laughter, just us. "This is weird," Sam whispered, sticking close to my side. "Where is everyone?" Jake didn't seem to care. He was already heading toward a booth marked, "Test Your Luck." Chris followed, and reluctantly, so did we. The booth was run by another masked figure, this one wearing a faded red jacket. On the counter sat a spinning wheel with symbols instead of numbers, stars, skulls, and what looked like a question mark. "Step right up," the figure said, their voice low and playful. "Spin the wheel and see what the night has in store for you." Jake stepped forward, laughing. "All right, let's see how lucky I am." The wheel spun, the symbols blurring together. It slowed, finally stopping on the skull. For a moment, the masked figure didn't move. Then they leaned in close, their voice a whisper. "Careful what you wish for." The lights flickered, and the fog seemed to thicken around us. A chill ran down my spine as I glanced at the other booths. They all seemed to be waiting, watching. "I don't like this," Sam said, gripping my arm. "This doesn't feel like a carnival. It feels like a trap." She was right. But by the time we realized it, there was no way out. The eerie silence of the carnival was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. No laughter, no music, just the faint creak of the Ferris wheel turning in the distance. The lights flickered slightly, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as we walked. Jake stood frozen at the booth, staring at the spinning wheel that had landed on the skull. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice uneasy for the first time. The masked figure tilted their head, their painted grin unmoving. "It means your game has been chosen. Follow the lights to booth 7. The lights along the path blinked on in sequence, leading deeper into the carnival. None of us moved. "Seriously, Jake," Sam whispered, gripping his arm. "Let's get out of here. This place is giving me the creeps." Jake shook her off, forcing a grin. "Come on, guys, it's just a theme. They're trying to make it feel mysterious. That's the whole point, right?" "Or it's a trap," Chris muttered, glancing over his shoulder. I didn't want to admit it, but I agreed with him. Still, Jake was already walking toward the glowing path, and I wasn't about to let him go alone. Reluctantly, the rest of us followed. Booth 7 was a small, rickety structure with peeling paint and a crooked sign that read, "The Maze of Shadows." The same masked figure from the gate was waiting for us, their porcelain grin unnerving in the dim light. "One player. The others may wait." Jake stepped forward without hesitation. "I'll do it." The figure handed him a lantern, its light flickering weakly. "Find your way to the center of the maze before the flame goes out. If it does..." The figure paused, their head tilting as if considering their words. "You will not return." "Return from where?" I asked, my voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they opened the door to the maze, revealing a narrow, twisting path lined with mirrors. The reflections distorted in the flickering lantern light, stretching and warping Jake's image as he stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the rest of us outside in tense silence. Jake's voice echoed faintly through the maze as he called out to us. "This isn't so bad," he shouted, though his tone carried a nervous edge. We couldn't see him, but we could hear the faint shuffle of his footsteps and the occasional clink of the lantern against the mirrors. Then, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, almost like the wind. But soon, they grew louder, more distinct. Multiple voices, overlapping, all saying the same thing: "Don't look back." Sam grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Do you hear that? Tell me you hear that." "I hear it," I whispered, my throat dry. Chris didn't say anything, but the way he kept shifting from foot to foot told me he was just as freaked out. "What's happening to him in there?" Sam asked, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, Jake screamed. The sound was sharp and guttural, cutting through the eerie calm like a knife. It was followed by the crashing of glass and the frantic shuffle of footsteps, then silence. For what felt like an eternity, we waited, the whispers still swirling around us. Finally, the door creaked open, and Jake stumbled out, his face pale and his breathing ragged. "Jake!" Sam rushed to him, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "Don't," he said, his voice hoarse. "Just don't." In his hand, the lantern flame flickered faintly, barely clinging to life. Whatever had happened in that maze, he'd made it out. But something about the way he looked at us, haunted, like he'd seen something we couldn't imagine, made it clear he wasn't the same. Before we could process what had happened, the masked figure reappeared. "The next game awaits," they said, pointing toward another glowing path. "Are you kidding me?" Sam shouted. "He's not even okay. You can't just... The rules must be followed," the figure said calmly, their porcelain grin as unchanging as ever. "Proceed or forfeit." "Forfeit?" Chris asked, narrowing his eyes. "What does that mean?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they stepped aside, revealing another booth. This one had a sign that read, "The Tower of Choices." "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jake spoke for the first time since leaving the maze. "It means one of us is next." The game was simple, in theory. A massive Jenga-like tower stood in the center of the booth, but instead of wooden blocks, it was made of shimmering glass. Each block had a question etched into it. Personal questions, secrets we didn't want to share. "You must remove one block at a time," the masked figure explained. "Answer the question honestly, or the tower will fall." "What happens if the tower falls?" Chris asked. The figure's grin seemed to widen, though the mask didn't move. "You don't want to know," Chris volunteered, stepping up to the tower. "Let's get this over with." The first block he pulled asked, "Have you ever betrayed someone you cared about?" Chris hesitated, glancing at Jake, then at me. "No," he said quickly. The tower wobbled, and the glass blocks shimmered dangerously. The masked figure tilted their head. "Truth only," they said. Chris swallowed hard. "Fine. Yes." I have the tower steadied, and Chris stepped back, shaking. "Happy?" One by one, we took turns, each block forcing us to confront things we'd buried. By the time the game was over, none of us could look each other in the eye. As we walked back toward the main path, Sam grabbed my hand. "This isn't just a carnival," she whispered. "It's playing with us. It knows things about us, things we've never told anyone." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that it was all just a creepy theme, but deep down, I knew she was right. The carnival wasn't just testing us, it was peeling us apart, and we were falling for it. The silence as we returned to the main path was suffocating. None of us spoke, and the only sound was the distant creak of the Ferris wheel turning slowly in the mist. Every step felt heavier, the weight of the carnival's games pressing down on us. Jake, who had been so eager to explore, now looked like a ghost of himself. Sam clung to my arm, her grip tighter than before, and Chris was quiet. Too quiet, his usual sarcasm replaced by something colder. "I think we should leave," Sam whispered. Jake stopped dead in his tracks, turning to face her. "And go where?" "Did you forget what that thing said?" He gestured toward one of the masked figures standing silently nearby. "They're not going to let us walk out." Sam's eyes darted toward the figure. "We could try." "Try and what? Get eliminated?" Jake's voice cracked. "You heard what they said. We play or we die." The masked figure ahead motioned for us to follow. Reluctantly, we moved down another glowing path that led to a towering structure. It loomed in the mist like a skeletal giant, its spindly frame barely visible under the weak carnival lights. As we got closer, I realized what it was: a tightrope, suspended high above a dark pit. A rickety wooden ladder led up to a narrow platform where the rope began, stretching across the void to a platform on the other side. The sign beside it read, "The Tightrope Challenge. Don't look down." "Great," Chris muttered, "because nothing says fun like plummeting to your death." Jake ignored him, stepping forward. "What's the rule this time?" The masked figure tilted their head. "Cross the rope without falling." Simple Jake let out a bitter laugh. "Sure, simple. And if we fall?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they pointed toward a faint flicker of movement below the rope. I squinted, my stomach flipping as I realized the pit wasn't empty. Shadows shifted and writhed, shapes that didn't make sense, a tangle of limbs and glowing eyes that seemed to be waiting. "Yeah," Chris said, backing up a step. "Hard pass." "The games must be played," the figure said. "Refusal is forfeiture." Sam's grip on my arm tightened. "Forfeiture?" she whispered. "They mean—" "Yeah," I cut her off, not wanting to hear the rest. Jake was the first to climb the ladder, his movements stiff and deliberate. The wooden rungs creaked under his weight, and I could hear his ragged breathing as he reached the top. The rope swayed slightly as he stepped onto it, his arms outstretched for balance. "Don't look down," Sam called after him, her voice trembling. "Not helping," Jake shot back, his voice tight with fear. Step by step, he inched forward, the rope swaying beneath him. From below, the pit seemed to come alive, the shadows writhing more violently as he moved. My heart pounded as I watched him, every muscle in my body screaming for him to hurry, to make it to the other side. Finally, he stepped onto the far platform, collapsing to his knees. "One down," he called weakly. Chris went next, muttering curses under his breath as he climbed the ladder. He moved faster than Jake. His steps hurried but steady. Halfway across, he paused, glancing down at the pit below. "Don't stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking. Chris snapped his head up, his face pale. "I'm fine," he muttered, forcing himself to keep moving. When he finally reached the platform, he didn't collapse like Jake. He just stood there, staring into the distance, his jaw clenched. When it was Sam's turn, she froze at the base of the ladder. "I can't do this," she whispered. "You have to," I said, grabbing her shoulders. "It's the only way." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded, climbing the ladder slowly. Her legs shook as she stepped onto the rope, her arms trembling as she tried to balance. "You've got this," I called, trying to keep my voice steady, just one step at a time. But halfway across, the rope swayed violently, and Sam let out a scream. For a horrifying moment, she teetered on the edge, her arms flailing. "Sam!" Jake shouted from the far platform. "Don't look down! Just keep moving!" She froze, her breaths ragged, then took another step, and another. Somehow, she made it, collapsing into Jake's arms as soon as she reached the platform. Now it was my turn. I climbed the ladder, my hands slick with sweat. The rope felt impossibly thin under my feet, swaying with every step. The pit below seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting as if they were watching me. "Don't think about it," I muttered to myself. "Just keep moving." I was 3 steps from the end when the rope jerked violently. My arms flailed as I tried to keep my balance, the edge of the platform so close, yet so far. "Move!" Jake shouted, reaching out his hand. With a final lunge, I grabbed the edge of the platform, Jake and Chris pulling me up as the rope swung wildly behind me. My chest heaved as I lay on the wooden planks, my heart racing. "That's it," I gasped. "We're done." But the masked figure on the far side of the pit shook their head. "Not quite," they said. "The night is still young." As we sat on the platform, catching our breath, I glanced back at the pit. The shadows below had stilled, but I could feel their presence, like they were waiting for the next person to fall. "This isn't a carnival," Sam whispered, her voice shaking. "This is something else." Jake didn't respond. He just stared at the next glowing path, his jaw tight. "We need to finish this," he said finally, "whatever it takes." The next glowing path seemed longer, twisting through the fog like it didn't want us to find the end. None of us spoke as we walked. What was there to say? Each game chipped away at us, both physically and mentally. The tightrope had left us shaken, but the carnival wasn't done with us yet. Sam clung to my side, her steps uneven. Jake led the way, his shoulders tense, while Chris trailed behind, muttering under his breath. The path opened into another section of the carnival, but this one was different. The rides were still there, but they weren't moving. The Ferris wheel was frozen mid-spin, its lights dimmed. The carousel creaked softly as it turned, even though there was no wind. The air felt heavier, colder, like the carnival itself was watching us. A booth stood in the center of the space, its sign flickering faintly. "The Room of Memories. What will you sacrifice?" A masked figure stepped forward, their porcelain grin as unsettling as ever. "This game is simple," they said. "One of you must enter the room and confront what is waiting inside. Success will require sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Jake asked, his voice sharp. The figure tilted their head. "You will see." Sam shook her head, panic rising in her voice. "I'm not going in there. I can't. I won't." Jake stepped forward, his jaw set. "I'll do it." "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "You've already done enough. Let me—" "No." Jake cut me off, his voice firm. "I've got this." The masked figure opened the door to the booth, revealing a pitch-black interior. Jake hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him, and we were left in silence once again. The minutes stretched on, each one heavier than the last. The sound of my heartbeat filled my ears as I stared at the booth, willing Jake to come back. But the longer we waited, the more I began to doubt he would. Then suddenly, the door creaked open. Jake stumbled out, his face pale and his eyes hollow. His hands were shaking, and for a moment, I thought he might collapse. Sam rushed to his side, but he pushed her away gently. "What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was old and faded, showing a younger Jake with two people who looked like his parents. "What is that?" Chris asked, frowning. Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's a memory. One I gave up to get out." "What do you mean, gave up?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. Jake looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "I don't remember them. I know they're important, but I don't know who they are. It's like they've been erased." The weight of his words settled over us like a dark cloud. The carnival wasn't just testing our courage or our strength. It was taking pieces of us, stripping away everything that made us who we were. Chris scoffed, breaking the silence. "So that's it? You gave up a memory? And now what? We move on to the next game?" "Do you have a better idea?" Jake snapped, his voice rising. "We don't get to choose. We play or we die." Chris opened his mouth to argue, but Sam cut him off. "Stop it, both of you! This isn't helping." For once, Chris didn't have a comeback. He just turned away, his jaw tight. The masked figure motioned for us to follow once more. The next booth was smaller, with a single chair in the center. The sign above it read, "The truth test, lie at your own risk." "What now?" Sam asked, her voice barely a whisper. The masked figure gestured to the chair. "One of you must sit. You will be asked 3 questions. Answer truthfully, or face the consequences." Chris stepped forward before anyone else could. "I'll do it." "Chris," I started, but he cut me off. "I said I'll do it," he snapped, glaring at me. "Don't act like you care now." Chris sat down, his expression defiant. The booth filled with a strange, mechanical hum, and the air seemed to grow colder. The first question came from nowhere, a deep, disembodied voice that made my skin crawl. "Have you ever deliberately hurt someone you love?" Chris hesitated, his jaw tightening. "No," he said. The lights flickered violently, and the voice boomed again. "Lie detected." Chris winced as the chair jolted beneath him, sending a shock through his body. "Fine," he shouted. "Yes, okay." "I have. Happy now?" The light steadied, and the voice asked the second question. "Would you betray your friends to save yourself?" Chris glanced at us, his face pale. "No," he said firmly. The lights flickered again. "Lie detected." Another jolt rocked the chair, and Chris let out a strangled cry. "All right, yes, I would. Is that what you want to hear?" The third and final question came, softer this time, but no less haunting. "Do you deserve to survive?" Chris froze. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "No." The lights dimmed, and the chair went still. Chris stood slowly, his face pale and his hands shaking. He didn't look at us as he walked out of the booth. By the time we reached the next path, it was clear the games were taking more than just physical tolls. Jake was distant, Chris was seething, and Sam was barely holding it together. "Do you think there's an end to this?" Sam asked quietly, her voice trembling. "There has to be," Jake said. "We just have to keep going." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The carnival didn't feel like it wanted us to win. It felt like it wanted to break us. The path ahead was darker than before, the glowing lights barely piercing the thick fog. The air felt colder, heavier, like the carnival itself was closing in on us. Jake led the way, his face hard and unreadable. Sam stayed close to me, her steps shaky, and Chris lagged behind, his silence more unsettling than his usual sarcasm. We didn't speak as we walked. There was nothing left to say. Each game had taken something from us. Our trust, our strength, even parts of ourselves. And now, we were heading to the final challenge, knowing only one of us would leave. The glowing path ended at a massive open space surrounded by flickering torches. At the center stood a raised platform, its edges jagged like broken glass. A sign hung above it, swaying slightly in the breeze. The Carousel of Truth. Only one can win. "What the hell is this?" Chris muttered, breaking the silence. A masked figure appeared, their porcelain grin as unchanging as ever. "Welcome to the final challenge," they said, their voice echoing in the empty space. "The rules are simple. Step onto the carousel. Answer the questions truthfully. Survive." "Survive?" Sam repeated, her voice trembling. "What does that mean?" The figure tilted their head. "The carousel spins faster with every lie. The one who remains standing will be declared the winner." The carousel itself was unnerving. Its surface was polished black, reflecting the torches like liquid fire. 4 spots were marked with faint outlines, one for each of us. I didn't want to step onto it. None of us did. But the masked figure stood there, waiting, their presence a silent threat. Jake was the first to move, climbing onto the platform without hesitation. Chris followed, his jaw set. I looked at Sam, who was pale and trembling, but she nodded, stepping forward. I climbed up last, my heart pounding in my chest. The carousel began to spin slowly, the torches blurring into streaks of light. The masked figure's voice rang out, "Let the game begin." The first question was directed at Jake. "What is your greatest regret?" He hesitated, his hands clenching into fists. "Not being there for my mom," he said finally, his voice tight. "She needed me, and I wasn't there." The carousel sped up slightly, but the voice didn't call him out. He'd told the truth. The next question was for Chris. "Do you think you deserve to win?" Chris sneered, his hands gripping the edge of the carousel. "Of course I do. I've played the game. I've done what I needed to do." The carousel wobbled, the speed increasing. "Lie detected!" Chris stumbled, cursing under his breath. "Fine," he growled. "Number I don't. Happy?" Sam's question was softer, but no less devastating. "Who do you blame for all of this?" Her eyes darted between us, her breathing ragged. I blame Jake," she said finally, her voice breaking. "You brought us here. You thought it was all a game." Jake flinched, but the carousel didn't speed up. She wasn't lying. When it was my turn, the question was a dagger. If it came down to it, would you sacrifice them to survive? My stomach twisted. I wanted to say no, to deny it, but the carousel hummed beneath me, warning me against lying. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I would." The others stared at me, their faces a mix of shock and betrayal. But the carousel stayed steady. The truth, no matter how ugly, was the only thing keeping us upright. The carousel spun faster, the questions cutting deeper. "Jake," the voice asked, "who would you save if you could only choose one?" He looked at Sam, then at me. "Sam," he said without hesitation. The carousel didn't speed up. Chris's question was harsher. "What's the worst thing you've done in this game?" He hesitated, his face pale. "I sabotaged someone," he admitted. "During the honeycomb game. I broke their peace and let them take the fall." The carousel stayed steady, but Sam turned away, disgusted. When it was my turn again, the question hit like a hammer. "Do you trust any of them?" I swallowed hard, my gaze flicking between them. "No," I said finally. "Not anymore." As the carousel spun faster, Chris stumbled, his foot slipping on the slick surface. He tried to steady himself, but the speed was too much. With a strangled cry, he fell, disappearing into the shadows below. "Chris!" Sam screamed, reaching out, but he was gone. The carousel didn't stop. It spun faster, the questions relentless. Sam faltered next, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Her final question was simple. "Do you forgive them?" She hesitated, her legs shaking. "Yes," she whispered. The carousel wobbled violently. "Lie detected." With a final scream, she slipped, vanishing into the darkness. It was down to me and Jake. The carousel spun so fast now that it was hard to stand, the force pulling at my legs. The final question was directed at both of us. "What are you willing to do to win?" Jake looked at me, his face pale but determined. "Anything," he said. The carousel hummed, but it didn't speed up. He wasn't lying. I hesitated, my throat dry. "The same," I said finally. The carousel slowed, the torches flickering as the masked figure stepped forward. "Congratulations," they said, their voice emotionless. "The game is over." When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the field where it all began. The carnival was gone, replaced by silence and the faint glow of dawn. At my feet was a black envelope. Inside was a single card. "Congratulations, you survived. Your prize awaits." I turned the card over, but there was no money, no instructions. Just 4 words that sent a chill down my spine. "See you next time."